Selected passages from Proverbs chapter 8. Does not Sophia call, and does not understanding raise her voice? On the heights, beside the way, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. Beside the gates in front of the town, at the entrance of the portals, she cries out. To you, O people, I call, and my cry is to all that live. I love those who love me, and those who diligently seek me, find me. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth, when there were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth, when he had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker. And I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and delighting in the human race. And now, my children, listen to me. Happy are those who keep my ways. Happy is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting beside my doors. For whoever finds me finds life.
Our second reading tonight comes from the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7. For Sophia, the fashioner of all things, taught me. For in her there is a spirit that is intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, clear, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable. For Sophia is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. For she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance into her. For she is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Though she is but one, she can do all things. And while remaining in herself, she renews all things. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets.
So in the last month or so, you have heard both Robert and myself in prayer and blessing use the name of Sophia. And we've been getting some questions about who or what Sophia is. Proof positive that you're listening. Sophia is one of the names of the feminine aspect of divinity in both the Jewish and the Christian traditions. Yes, it may come as a shock to you, but the understanding of divinity as having a feminine aspect does exist in both the Jewish and the Christian traditions. This feminine aspect has been called by different names. The most common probably is Sophia, and referred to in different languages and with different images, which causes a little bit of confusion when we talk about her. Sophia is a Greek word. It means wisdom. The Hebrew, which is, of course, she was referred to first in the Old Testament, is Chokmah. I prefer Sophia to wisdom because when I use Sophia, it's very clear we're talking about a feminine aspect, where wisdom is a neuter word. Something I wanted to touch on really quickly before I go on here. Sophia is not a goddess. We belong to a monotheistic tradition. The divinity is one. But the divinity, as I understand it, has many, many aspects. And this feminine face is one of the aspects of divinity. And so I just wanted to touch base a bit before we go further that because I've had confusion talking to people about this in the past. The first time I heard the word Sophia was back in 1992. It was in a worship service. And I heard it in an invocation that went something like, "We call upon the Christ and the Sophia." And I was not impressed. Sophia, it wasn't familiar other than a woman's name. It wasn't familiar as a concept to me at all. And invoked seemingly equally with Christ was a little disturbing. So my thoughts went more or less like this. Okay, it's California. God knows what kind of New Age nonsense they've made up here. In the 12-step programs, we call that contempt prior to investigation. But then I did get curious and I started digging, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I found. Sophia first appears in the later texts of the New Testament, or of the Old Testament, in what's called the wisdom literature. In some of this literature, she is not referred to necessarily as feminine, although Chokmah is feminine, but as sort of wisdom with a capital W. But by the time we get to Proverbs, which is where one of our readings comes from, she is clearly the personified feminine aspect of divinity. And there's really no doubt about that when we see Proverbs 8 and 9, where there are a lot of references that make that clear. Now, it's interesting. These texts define Sophia in terms of contradictions, and that turns out to be pretty important as we follow her story into the Christian tradition. She is at once created and that which is created. She's the teacher, and she's that which is taught. She's divine presence and elusive knowledge. She's the tempting harlot, my personal favorite, and the faithful wife. Sophia, and she defies the feminine norms, certainly the norms of antiquity, which is when these texts were written about her, but even today to some extent, at least in my experience. She's a woman, but she is no lady. We see her crying aloud at street corners, raising her voice in public squares, offering her saving counsel to absolutely anyone who will listen to her. She is busy in the public sphere. She is no shrinking violet, no vessel waiting to be given her significance by someone else. She's very much contained in her own self. And so, as I dug more into the Jewish tradition, I discovered that the Jewish mystics had taken some of these ideas about Sophia and expanded on them, expanded quite a bit, as it turns out. Among the Jewish mystics, there's this idea that when God created all that we see, he first had to pull, and they refer to him as him, he first had to pull back and allow room for creation to happen, but not pull back completely. This feminine part of divinity remained and infused all of creation as creation unfolded. So like in the passages we heard in Proverbs, she is there at creation and she is part of creation. Also, there's this idea that she marks the beginning of time, that she represents first movement. As the breath of God, the Ruah, moves upon the face of the waters, I believe is where they get that idea originally. So she's first movement. And she is the ordering principle that brings order out of chaos. So again, intimately involved with these ideas of creation, this bringing of order out of chaos. And she continues to do that, and that's the primary reason she's associated with the principle of wisdom. Now, the Jewish mystics, we're now in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century and on into the High Middle Ages, at a time when in the Jewish mystical tradition they're developing what we know today as Kabbalah. And Sophia begins to be called Shekinah. Shekinah does not mean wisdom, it means roughly God has made a dwelling place among us. But she has the same qualities and then some. So there's a great body of work that talks about the Shekinah, and actually the key text of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, the Book of Radiance, talks very much about her. The opening lines are about the Shekinah. And in that book, she is talked about as the source of prophecy. We heard this in Proverbs, that she is the source of prophecy, and certainly in the wisdom of Solomon. She's fire, cloud, wind, all of these things, by the way, that we associate with the Holy Spirit. And she's also associated with the rose, interestingly. In the Catholic tradition, the Virgin Mary got the rose. Now, the other place I found Sophia is in the early Christian texts. And in those texts, when Sophia is mentioned, what we find is this theme of the encompassing of opposites. These texts tend to be about balance. They tend to be about healing and about making the opposites one. So in each of us lives opposites of many, many kinds. But what's talked about a lot in this material from early Christianity is the idea that we all have the masculine and feminine principles within us. And until those principles integrate, we don't move toward wholeness. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about balance and wholeness, and we'll hear some more passages from some of this early Christian material, not to be found in your New Testaments, about balance and about the integration of masculine and feminine. And also in some of this early Christian mythology, Sophia rescues humanity. She becomes almost this redeemer figure, where she comes down, descending from the light into the depths, and breaks the chains that chain humanity in darkness, and wakes them up. So the probably the most famous passage in these texts, "Arise and wake from your sleep, and remember that you are children of the light." And one more passage from these early texts that were marginalized, that were considered, by the way, to be heresy, but that we are becoming familiar with again, these texts that were found in the middle of the 20th century in complete form, so that we really could read them and see what it was those early church fathers were so upset about. And here's one of them. This one I mentioned Tuesday at Many Lights. I was talking about Mary Magdalene. As for the Sophia who is barren, she is the mother of the angels. So already we see these opposites. She is barren and she is mother. As for the Sophia who is barren and the mother of the angels, and the companion of the Lord, Mary Magdalene. Yeah. So we have this association of this feminine face of divinity with Mary Magdalene, and what happens in some of this material is we have Jesus as the Christ and Mary Magdalene representing the Sophia. Again, not something that is consistent with what I learned in catechism and what you all heard about, I'm sure, in Sunday school. So why am I spending time talking about this topic? Sophia, yes, she is there in Proverbs and the wisdom of Solomon, But just in a few passages, quite frankly, if we take the whole corpus of the Bible, it's really a very, very small part of it where we get these passages about a feminine divinity. And besides that, what we have are the Jewish mystics and the early Christian heretics who are talking about Sophia. And so why bring it up? This is clearly not something that's front and center in our scriptures. And the argument that's been made is precisely the argument I just made. It's a small amount of information. It's in the wisdom books, which have a lot of strange stuff in them. This is just a strange thing. And, maybe metaphor, we don't know what. And then, of course, there are the heretics, and we're not going to be discussing that in good company. So I do find them important, as you can imagine, or I wouldn't be up here talking about them. And for a couple of reasons. As a woman, of course, I'm really glad to read passages about an aspect of divinity that looks like me. And I'm aware, of course, of the political and the social justice implications of a model of divinity that shines forth as a reflection of all of our faces in humanity, and by the way, of all of the species upon the earth and all of creation. But what I find really, really important and what gives me passion about this material is that wherever Sophia is found, what is also found is this underlying theology of wholeness, of healing, of encompassing and bringing together the opposites. It's a theology where we affect divinity and divinity affects us. So it's a very relational kind of a theology, and where when each one of us is healed, all of creation moves toward that healing. It's very similar to what we find in the Jewish tradition, this idea of tikkun, the great restoration. It's this sense that when each of us heals, we pull it all forward with us. Now, in a few weeks, I'm going to be talking, as I said, about balance and the integration of opposites and spending a lot more time on that topic. But for today, just understand that this encompassing of all of the opposites is at the core of some of the alternative Christianities. They didn't find a place in Orthodox Christianity, but I believe that they have a place now in the 21st century, that they have something very important to say to us. I actually think that it is no mistake and no coincidence that this material was rediscovered in the 20th century after laying in those caves for 17 centuries, where the material couldn't be destroyed, as many of these early texts were. So I'll finish with words from one of those texts found at Nag Hammadi in 1945 called Thunder, Perfect Mind. It is a text wholly in the voice of the feminine divinity. She speaks of herself in opposites. Again, we have that theme coming back. I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the silence that is incomprehensible, and the idea whose remembrance is frequent. I am she who exists in all fears and strength in trembling. I am senseless and I am wise. I am the one whom you have hidden from, and you appear to me. Hear me, you hearers, and learn of my words, you who know me. I am the hearing that is attainable to everything. I am the speech that cannot be grasped. I am the name of the sound and the sound of the name. I am the first and